Thank you very much for Women's Place UK for hosting this event and for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, and you've made such a huge difference to the movement. Thank you. In November 2003, I published my first article on the trans issue. And maybe we could talk later about why I chose that time, because we've got no particular time now, but in the Q&A. But it was in the Telegraph magazine supplement, and the headline read, "I changed for all the wrong reasons, and then it was too late." And the story was pegged on a trans person by the name of Claudia, who, as a young gay man, very, very unhappy with his body and his life, came under pressure first from his boyfriend and then was fast-tracked by a shyster doctor called Russell Reed after a 20-minute consultation, and ended up having the full surgery and has lived since as the opposite sex. And I'd like to say that Claudia since then has been bullied, harangued and cast asunder from whatever the trans community was supposed to be for speaking out in support of what many feminists are saying. And the stand first in the piece read, "When, if ever, should a person have a sex change operation? And whose decision is it to make?" Julie Bindel reports on concerns that psychiatrists are too ready to recommend the knife. Already I've committed at least 10 hate crimes, right, just by reading this from 2003. Those were the days. And I interviewed somebody called Dr. Lindsay Miskow, a GP and sex therapist at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, who counsels equal numbers of men and women wishing to change sex, she said. And she told me this on the phone. There was a study in 1995 where the brains of 6 exhumed transsexuals were examined and found to be more like those of the opposite gender. So obviously huge sample, very scientific study here. And bearing in mind that she obviously believed that being transsexual was genetic, I asked her when she would look out for signs in children. And she said, it would definitely be apparent by the time they are 3 years old. If girls are playing primarily with trucks and footballs, and boys with dolls and prams, then there's very likely a problem. So I wrote in the piece about mermaids, and I explained what it was and that it had been founded in 1993, and that children as young as 14 were receiving puberty blockers, despite the fact that the Portman Clinic suggested that 1 in 4 teenagers who don't want gender reassignment will later change their minds. And bearing in mind this was 20 years ago, you would think they might have learned their lesson as opposed to have dug themselves further into it. And I say, transsexualism is the only psychiatric or medical condition where the patients can diagnose themselves. So at that time, I'd begun writing for Guardian Weekend magazine. It was edited by Catherine Viner, and she can be credited with getting me into journalism and was a very, very supportive editor indeed. And she really liked my thesis about transsexuality. Lots of people that I met just after that piece was published that had read it, including many journalists, were saying, oh, how interesting, so you question the actual diagnosis of transsexuality, because it was a given that there are some people who were born in the wrong body. And really it wasn't questioned, but many of us felt uncomfortable with it. And by many, I mean feminists primarily. Now, Julie Burchill went on holiday. She took 2 weeks off from her very popular column at the Weekend magazine, and Kath asked me to stand in for Burchill. And so my first column, published on the 31st of January 2003, which was entitled Gender Benders Beware, We Don't Make the Headlines, was about a brilliant organisation called Vancouver Rape Relief, which is in Canada, and already they were driving the trans train way faster than we were, and they had been tied up in litigation by a trans person called Kimberly Nixon, who was obviously male and who was presenting as female and demanded that he join the training programme to directly counsel victims of sexual assault. And Vancouver Rape Relief very, very calmly and respectfully said no, and waiting in the wings were their version of Liberty, and they decided to take a test case against Vancouver Rape Relief and tied them up in the end with 20 years of litigation. And I don't know if any of you have been watching the Amy Ham proceedings, the nurse in Vancouver who's taken their version of the NHS to tribunal because of the usual, I'm sure you can all guess why, she's tweeted something. Well, the same lawyer acting against her, and if you watch the tribunal proceedings, you can pick out the lawyer because she's the one with the blue hair, seriously. She's called Barbara Findlay, she, her, and she is the same lawyer that tried to destroy Vancouver Rape Relief those decades ago. And my column had been one of the first from a magazine supplement to go online. I mean, it was just at the time when these articles were being put online. The Telegraph one hadn't been online, but this one was noted by many of the trans activists that were using listservs, which was pre the internet being in popular use in terms of social media. And so there was a lot of kerfuffle. And here's what I said. I said that the arrogance of Nixon, thinking that he could understand what living as a woman was after going through gender reassignment in later life, was just unbelievably arrogant. And I also mentioned a case that had been heard at the Equal Opportunities Commission, which was in 2002, and I say, it supported the case of 5 male to female transsexuals, only one of whom had disposed of his meat and 2 veg, on the grounds of sex discrimination after a pub landlord objected to one of them using the women's toilets. The claim was rejected, with the judge stating that although he accepted the claimant's wish to regard themselves as women, a person's wish doesn't determine what he is. Quite. And I said, call me old-fashioned, but I thought the one battle we feminists won fair and square was to convince at least those left of centre that gender roles are made up. Think about a world inhabited just by transsexuals. It would look like the set of Grease. And obviously, the point I was making was a feminist point. It was about sex stereotypes driving this issue and driving this ideology. So the articles were published 10 weeks apart, one in a newspaper read almost exclusively by Tories, and the other our only Liberal newspaper. And 200 letters of complaint were sent to The Guardian. The reader's editor that looks after such matters came down very firmly on the side of the complainants and apologised for the newspaper publishing me. At the time, Press for Change, the organisation leading the way to introduce the Gender Recognition Act, which came into force the following in 2005, were heavily lobbying. And this apology in the following Saturday's newspaper really was very, very grovelling. But Kath Viner defended me rigorously. She said, we thought that what Julie Bindel was writing was particularly interesting because it came from her, a lesbian activist for the rights of women and children. She is a rare kind of writer who puts her money where her mouth is. Now, it was obviously to Kath and to others, and I think from my words, that this was a feminist on the left writing about harmful sex stereotypes that can have a real material effect on the lives of women, in particular those that rely on single-sex spaces and those of us that have been sexually assaulted or were at risk of it. But no, because the gay press then moved in, you see, and they started to vilify me. And although nothing really changed in terms of the way that I was being commissioned by newspapers, and certainly not at The Guardian, Pink News, at the time I think it might have been Pink Paper, went berserk. And Benjamin Cohen, who is still the chief exec, did I mention I'd sued Pink? Not very many know about that. But at that time I knew him through kind of journalist circles, and I'm about to get to Ben later on, actually. I'll save that
Julie, just be aware that time-wise,
say that again?
Just be aware time-wise, you've kind of had quite a lot.
That's fine.
So
we can
I
talk about
don't
Ben
want
later.
to cut short your story, but just be
Just
aware.
remind me of Ben later. And then things moved forward, because in 2007 I took part in a Radio 4 live debate where you present an unpopular idea. Mine was sex change surgery is unnecessary mutilation. And I pointed out that there were more sex change operations in Iran than in the Western world. And you're challenged by 4 activists and experts on the other side. So I faced 4 trans activists, including Stephen Whittle and Peter Tatchell. And it was shortly after that, in 2008, that I was officially no-platformed along with 5 fascist groups by the National Union of Students. And that's when it all began, with Stonewall offering me, well, actually I was nominated for an award and they were picketed by 200 trans activists, and The Guardian commissioned me continually, and Catherine Viner and another editor came to the awards at Stonewall, stood up for me 100%. And then Guardian US was launched in 2011, and that's when things started to change. I started to be kind of frozen out and challenged and questioned far more. And at that time, a number of trans-identified men were given columns, were being commissioned to write quite a bit in The Guardian and across other media outlets. And of course, I have no concern about that at all. But feminists with my point of view, or similar, were being commissioned less and less. That same year, Channel 4 reality documentary My Transsexual Summer was screened. 2012, and this is pivotal, I think, Transmedia Watch. Do you know who they are? They go around talking to newspaper editors and other media platforms and tell newspaper editors and the rest that trans people will die if they don't change their coverage, and if they don't use preferred pronouns and the like, and if they ever dead name anyone as they would refer to it. And they also gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry, which was highly influential. And this is where I think things really shifted. And then in 2013, in the January, Suzanne Moore wrote about women's anger. I think it was called Seeing Red. It was for the New Statesman, and the esteemed Helen Lewis, I think, maybe even commissioned it.
Yeah, I published it, yeah.
A great column in which she was talking about sexism and misogyny, and she said women were angry with themselves for, quote, not having the ideal body shape, that of a Brazilian transsexual. And at that time, Twitter was in full flow. Suzanne meant absolutely nothing other than some kind of compliment about, I don't know, women's legs, who would know? But it certainly wasn't anti-trans. Suzanne joined the left-wing feminist Nazis. We were a growing group. And then, of course, I remember about a week after that, just about to go to sleep on a Saturday night, receiving a text from the lovely Suzanne saying, oh my God, we're fucked. Julie Burchill has defended us in The Observer tomorrow. And it was a nasty piece. It was cruel and it was crude. And Julie Burchill, it wasn't that she went too far, it's that she said things that were unnecessarily nasty and horrible and personal, where she poured scorn on the appearances of trans people. It was cruel. And she did it in order to defend Suzanne primarily and me as a little side line. And of course, that was another moment in history where, for the first time ever, The Observer were bullied into removing her column. It had never been done, but it was taken down. And then, of course, Paris Lees, a trans activist who identifies as a journalist, I understand, became the Pink List's #1 LGBTQI plus person that year, and civil war broke out between trans people who thought that the old guard of Press for Change were not really serving the blue fringe non-binaries, pansexuals, aromantics very well, and therefore the new guard strove forward. And at the same time, the senior commissioning editor in Guardian Features became very close to a misogynistic trans activist, trans woman. Another senior commissioning editor made a speech at Women of the World in which she praised Paris Lees and another trans activist called Janet Mock, who called women fish, and she praised them for their work for women. and a stark warning had been sent out. Get on the wrong side of the trans debate and ruin your career. Thank you.